Okay, assalamu alaikum. It's afternoon now. I'm taking a chance. The the grandchildren upstairs. so I'm taking a reading. The first one is we're now reading the introduction. So to this particular book, the edited version of Professor Ajam's book. Okay, introduction. Professor M.T. Ajam's doctoral thesis focuses on the historic, religious, political, economic, and sociological background for the establishment of the Rahmania Primary School, which is the first Muslim Islam based school, and other Islam oriented schools in Cape Town during the period 1860 to 1980. The work touches on Muslim learning culture in Cape Town prior to 1860, schooling opportunities for Cape Town Muslims from 1860 to 1920, Muslim Western educational interests, and the establishment of the first Muslim primary school in 1900 to 1920, the founding of Islam-oriented schools from 1921 to 1940, the Muslim Mission School, and the changing political climate from 1940 to 1980. It also deals with the school, with the education. It also deals with the educational policies and the Islam-oriented schools of Cape Town. The thesis evaluates the Muslim community's modernization of their schools and the community's efforts to promote their freedom to perpetuate their culture. Now, the Muslims used to call their schools madrasas, and so schools basically is a modernization of their education. Okay, the struggle happened during a period where the white dominant rulers aimed to present a scenario that schools function in isolation to socio-economic, cultural, and political agendas. That there is a universal validity that education is correct from only a white perspective. It still is. That only Christian schools can exist, that Eurocentric education is superior, still trying to push that in terms of the structures of the academia itself, and that all education must ensure the socio-economic dominance of white culture. Still is, and so many of us buy into it. Well, we speak English, so it's very interesting. The British have had a really good influence on our culture, obviously, because we speak English now. And so many of our terminology in the Arabic language and culture has been influenced by the English language, which actually waters down the Arabic power. And that's my work, basically, in my research and my development of resources, is to raise the English language to the level of the Arabic, because the Arabic is extremely rich. So hopefully, inshallah, people will read and see the power of the Arabic language, how it actually enhances your English language, or any language for that matter, because it's much deeper. Okay, so let's continue the reading of the introduction. I'm pausing in between so that it doesn't become like a boring kind of a reading, of a text. That we have a little bit of live kind of interaction and so on, even though it's not a live kind of interaction, it's a recording. Despite all white efforts, in inverted commas, records indicate that prior and after the first 50 years after the Union, prior and after the first 50 years after the Union of South Africa in 1910, their aims were frustrated. The white Christian cultural aim of education were frustrated by the Muslim community's zeal to ensure the Islamic cultural learning heritage, even though laws existed that non-whites, including Muslims, should only receive a basic education up to grade 4, which is the old standard 2, and should be discriminated against regarding funding and access to higher education. Can you see that that's the way in which they kept the masses dependent on the few white dominant class and training? So they didn't allow non-whites to actually go further than grade 4. Further education was needed. Further education obviously was needed for the new economic life. Cape Town was So what happens is the economy actually pushed them as well, even though they tried to keep the Muslims and the masses at a low level. The economic development of the Cape forced them to start training and opening up doors for the masses in order to fill up new positions due to new products and international trade, etc. So it becomes a necessary feature. Economics drives the need for successful business, drives companies to upgrade their workers, even in those days, still today. Okay. So Cape Town was a hub of commercial and industrial activity with a large, diverse population. Soon the dominant white enfranchised realized that unless they begin to accommodate the subjected peoples, they will find themselves out on a limb. They were forced to consider the modernization and of the subjugated peoples if they wish to survive. The Dutch and English occupiers found themselves perplexed by the interdependent mix of citizens, other settler European communities, dark-skinned slaves, political exiles, Asian mercenary craftsmen and women, princes from the East, each having their own language and traditional cultures. So there's your first indication that the Muslims were not slaves, in that there's a specific Asian mercenary craftsmen and women. And the dark-skinned slaves, you will relate again that most of the slavery was black people being sold by their own leaders in Africa to the whites. That's the saddest part in my economic studies in economics, where we deal with the actual slave trade and how the leaders of the countries actually sold their own people. Now, they also found a strong Islamic faith amongst the skilled free Muslim craftsmen and women. The rulers also had to accept that each of the people of the Cape contributed to the moral tone of the city, and thus they have to be considered. Now, the accommodation was planned to ensure preferential treatment of colonial, racial, religious, economic, and cultural notions. They did not expect the power of the Islamic faith with its own legal and learning culture and its welcoming nature to all, including the slaves of the Cape. This practice of the Muslims would serve to narrow the gap between the free and the enslaved citizens. The Muslims of the Cape were actually effectively the emancipators of the slaves and not the descendants of slaves. And you can see how that will happen later on in the text. The Islamic social culture provided the slaves a sense of belonging, which the rulers failed to give. Now, this is not something that Ajam sucked out of his thumb. This is basically reported by certain leaders, colonial leaders, who made these comments. The welcoming nature of the Muslims caused many slaves and some of the Europeans who mixed with the Muslims to embrace Islam. Very interesting. There were Dutch people, there were British people that became Muslim, which also showed the power of the Muslim culture, free Muslim culture in the Cape, because they couldn't have developed such a powerful tradition and faith that colonialists would actually find this interesting and become Muslim. The power of religion drove the subjugated, while economic dominance drove the ruling class. Very, very good point that Professor Ajam makes. You must remember, I extract the introduction from the works of the thesis, from the gist of what Professor Ajam is talking about, and also what references he actually extracted to give a kind of a general introduction. So this is not my work in real terms, it's just me putting together the real language and the nuance of the actual thesis. So the power of religion drove the subjugated, while economic dominance drove the ruling class. The ruling class attempted to assimilate the subjugated into the Christian Eurocentric culture through church schools and church-supported medical care, especially the maternity institutions. This is the kind of methodology they used. The struggle of the Muslims against the assimilation was a natural effort of the Muslims to maintain their religious, practical needs, and also to ensure that they embody the Islamic doctrine of equality, freedom, and social justice. That is a very core feature of Islam, in that it drives its culture, it drives its religion, but it also drives equality. It also drives social development and economic sustainability and progress. And that's basically captured in the Sharia, which is the guidance from the Creator in the Quran and in the Sunnah of Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also, for instance, in the meaning of the word Sharia, which means a waterhole, a refreshment station. It's a place you go to in order to enhance your thinking and to empower your practical application to life's needs in every particular way, as I would say, holistically. Okay. The struggle of the Muslims against the assimilation was a natural effort of the Muslims to maintain their religious practical needs and also to ensure that they embody the Islamic doctrine of equality, freedom, and social justice. This was to the rulers and dominant class a great challenge because it presented a moral code, while the colonists were materially motivated and was hoping to succeed in making the subjugated dependent on materialism that would automatically allow them to further control the subjugated. And that's basically the aim of education, if you look at it carefully, is to subjugate people through certifications, etc., so that they become dependent on the colonial culture in order to get a job. That's the main thing. When slavery fell, you had the introduction of education through certification in order to subjugate the people. Islam was brought to the Cape. Now I also try to incorporate in the introduction part of the prehistory that Professor Ajahn brings to the table here. Islam was brought to the Cape via the free craftsmen, very important. Political exiles, also important. Captured princes, contractual workers from the East Asia, and voluntary immigrants who settled in the Cape. Extremely important point there. So there's no, the people of Bukab were not the descendants of slaves. They were descendants of the craftsmen and the political exiles and the contractual workers and the voluntary kind of immigrants that came to settle in Cape Town to develop, because it's a new economy. I mean, even the Europeans came to Cape Town in order to start a new economy, because Europe was already breaking down on the other side. The Islam had a formidable influence on the Cape cultural milieu. The Muslim influence could be seen in the Cape's architecture, the cuisine, the fashion of that time. Remember that the Muslims were brought to the Cape to be the builders of the houses and to be the dressmakers and the tailors of their colonialists. As workers, as people who actually earn a salary and a wage. That is why it was so easy for them when the Dutch moved away from the Cape to buy the property, because they were already business people, they were already self-sustainable. So the attempts to westernize and Christianize the Cape Muslims were met with the development of Madrasas, Muslim homeschools, which coincided with community-based craftsmanship training. These home madrasas created spiritual and temporal survival for the Muslims. They could give one another jobs through the craftsman training. Okay, these home madrasas created the spiritual and temporal survival of the Muslims. These religious and skills building practices of the Muslims created a broader social stability, peace, cultural, and professional development order at the Cape. Extremely important. when the Christians said that Muslims cannot go to school beyond grade standard 2, they said, fine, it's okay. We don't need your education because you're going to make our children Christian. It doesn't matter whether they're clever or not. We take them out of school. If they can basically read and write, we'll teach them a craft. And the craftsman who teaches them, so in our language, the leerbas, he will then teach them the religion as well. And in that way, they could actually sustain themselves economically by giving one another jobs. The kids would be early skilled, etc., and expand their own particular business. And that was very difficult for the colonialists to actually withstand because they needed the craftsmen. Okay, so that's a very important point there. And there were many old madrasas that educated the people about how to salah and how to clean yourself, etc. Very important about the deen. The first thing is to learn how to clean yourself and how to salah, because this is the most important thing. And then obviously you need to be able to learn the Arabic, etc. And to sustain your belief, because we're not living for this world, we're living for this world and the life hereafter. So whereas a colonialist lives just for this world and just wants to exploit people. So that was the basic difference here. So these home madrasas created the spiritual and temporal survival for the Muslims. These religious and skills-building practices of the Muslims created a broader social stability, peace, cultural and professional development order at the Cape. The home madrasa ensured cultural and religious production and transmission. The Cape Muslims thus created their own alternative Islam-oriented schools and skills training centers, which was basically the skilled craftsmen that basically in their homes would teach the religion as well as the craft. So the homeschooling was a big deal in terms of the Boer Kaap and the Muslims of the Cape. They had training centers in their homes and thus effectively withstood the Christianization and Westernization strategies of the dominant ruling class. The restrictions on Muslims to grade 4 in the church schools thus had little effect on the socio-economic challenge presented by the ruling class. They said that if you want to go further, you must become Christian. Now, in this particular thesis, 9 Muslim families became Christian to get higher education beyond standard 2 or grade 4. The rest said, fine, we don't need your education. Allah provides. God provides us with rizq, with sustenance. You're not our provider. That's the kind of strength that the Muslims of old had. They didn't believe in a certificate. They believed in the Creator giving them a sustenance. Right, so the Muslims, now one was very important is the Muslims' sober habits. They didn't drink wine. Were attractive to all the non-Muslim and Cape Townians and business people. They didn't drink wine because the religion does not allow them to become senseless. Their religion, the Muslims' religion, provided the Cape Muslims a sense of protection against full-on discrimination. So they were discriminated against, but because they didn't drink wine, there was a kind of an advantage they had over other workers and other people, because they could present themselves better than even the colonialists, because if they get drunk, they're useless, they become just as weird. So the Muslims, through the Arabic recital skills, this is an extremely important feature, the Muslims, through the Arabic recital skills, created another core bastion against Western Christian culturalization, an academic community language called Afrikaans Arab, and which is their language written in Arabic script. Now, this was the beauty of the Imams. Their duty is to teach the basics of the deen, and the people didn't read the European languages, but they were taught how to recite Quran. So the Imams used to teach the people through the Arabic letters their particular needs of cleanliness and salah and all of the needs, etc., to be a good Muslim. They would write it in Arabic letters. Now, the ulama of the past, the scholars of the past, all over the world, they would translate the people's language into Arabic. So you have these books all over all over the world that was written in the language of the people, such as the Timbuktu scripts, etc., written in Arabic script, but the people's language. And this was a beautiful thing that they created, which made the text that they used, the language that they used, inaccessible to the colonialists. And that made the Muslims much more powerful because they couldn't penetrate the Muslims community with their language, doing missionary work and denying them the education until beyond grade 4, and not reading the Latin script and the Latin the European languages was actually their protection, alhamdulillah. And them writing in their own script was actually another protection because the colonialists couldn't understand that. And so they didn't know what the Muslims were doing, basically. So the Muslims with the Arabic recital skills created another core bastion against Western Christian culturalization, an academic community language, Afrikaans, Arab, or Arabic letters. And I called it in my thesis for the first time in the Cape Town arena, I call it CAPS. Because I found out that you can't really call it Afrikaans, nor can you call it Arabic, although the Arabic script is being used, but it was peculiar to the Cape, to the Boerkaap, and to the District 6, and the close people, Salter River, etc. It wasn't further on. It didn't, in actual fact. The more further from Cape Town they moved, the more it became either Dutch or English or whatever the case would be. But in the city, the Boerkaap people had this influence on the language. And the imams used to write their khutbahs, their lectures on Friday in this particular language. Later on, it became in Latin script, but also in Afrikaans, Arab, as they call it, or in Kaaps. And the imams used to project a kind of a language which is official, which is professional in the language of the people, and not perhaps as flat or as mixed as the people in the street, but using that language to empower the people and to raise the level of their understanding, which was really interesting. These imams were very, very powerful in the Boerkaap, and that's why it becomes completely ludicrous to say that the Muslims are descendants of slaves in the Boerkaap, because it was impossible, because they had established schools and they had established imams and leadership. It was like and I think I pointed out later on, it was a state within a state, which Dr. Ajam presents. The full appreciation of the struggle and successes of the Cape Muslim community can be appreciated when one goes deeper into the challenges the Muslims faced at the Cape and how they overcame it. The colonial narrative that the Cape Muslims were descendants of slaves is questioned by the fact that Lord Charles Somerset promulgated in 1823 compelled Christian slave owners to send their slave children to Christian missionary schools after Lord Caledon Lord Caledon's complaint since 1807 that imported Mozambican slaves were becoming Muslim. The Muslims of the Cape were thus the emancipators of slaves through their practice of Islam. Now, what is an interesting feature, it coincides with the fact that they don't drink. One of the things that the basic features of slavery was you cannot keep your own name. They cut you off from your family. They cannot marry. You cannot hold your own religion. You can't own property. And you cannot be educated. It was actually law, you cannot educate slaves. So there, another point of the fact that the Boerkaap people are descendants of slaves can't be true, because they were educated and they had the freedom. You'll find later on more proof of that. They were educated themselves. They were craftsmen. They had their own language. They had their own leaders, etc., from the beginning, from 1658 onwards. So it's a powerful community. And so the slave owners used to want their slaves to the black slaves not to, in actual fact, drink wine. So they would send them on an off day to Boerkaap to become Muslim, actually, not realizing that when the Africans became Muslim, they don't drink anymore, but they can marry. because they were not allowed to marry as slaves under the colonial rule. They could marry as Muslims under the Sharia, the Islamic law, and have legitimate children under the eyes of God. And some of these black slaves who became Muslim later on, if one looks at the history of Lady Barnard in the books on her, some of them who become Muslim became freedom fighters. In actual fact, they would kill unfair slaves or oppressive slaves as a jihad to free other slaves. So they were not very interested in having Muslim slaves because they were powerful people that will fight them. And that makes sense why they would send to Anguru to Cape Town and Muslim exiles, political prisoners to Cape Town, because they don't want the Muslims to come in uprise wherever they were. So so that's another particular feature, that they were not very happy, not very safe. They didn't feel safe having Muslim slaves. They'd rather let them work for them and pay them a salary or a wage. Because so the craftsmen in actual fact had their own imams. Imams came here, and some Arabs came here to actually propagate Islam as well, or to teach the people. So there's a lot of people in Buakab who are direct descendants of Arab leaders that came to settle here to actually do da'wah. Because you must remember that part of Islam is to go out and to not propagate, but to help people come back to their original self. And then giving them that particular freedom. If one looks at Arabic history, you'll find that the Arabs went out to actually free the people from oppressive rulers. And the people would urinate, make those sounds when the Arabs would come in and conquer, because they knew they're going to get their freedom, and they were not forced to become Muslim, and they were protected. They were allowed to practice their Christianity and their Judaism, and many of them, and they became Muslim out of their own, because the rulers were powerful people who really followed the Quran, which says there is no compulsion in religion. You cannot force people to become a Muslim, but you can practice in such a way that they want to become Muslim. And that's basically how the spread of Islam was so fast. So people would say, yes, it wasn't spread by the sword. It was spread by trade, etc. All of those teachers fall in line. If one could say, it was spread by communication in terms of trade, by imams spreading Islam, etc., and also by fighting oppressive rulers and taking them out, and then freeing the people to be free. One day I was in a meeting in Sea Point in a Jewish community many years ago, and the Jews were complaining about the Muslims, etc. And the rabbi stood up and said, "Excuse me, if it wasn't for the Muslims who conquered Jerusalem, we wouldn't have had Judaism. They protected us so that we could have our synagogues." And the whole hall was quiet, because it was a very well-known rabbi from Sea Point who told him that because Muslims conquered Jerusalem in that particular area, they made it possible for the Jews to establish their faith and to have their faith and their freedom. Otherwise, they would have been obliterated. So we now come to the Muslims prior to 1860, which is very interesting in terms of what happened before. I touched on it already, but here is part of the actual text now. Now I'm going to stop at this point because it's 29. It's half an hour already. I had such fun doing it. I actually didn't realize I'm going over a normal 20 minutes or something like that. But okay, I hope you enjoyed it. That was the full introduction. So that is part 6 now.